All right, so thank you, Jay, for the introduction. My name is Andrew. I've been working on, among other things, at Factom on the DHS project that we've had for a while. And today I'm just going to review our work so that you could be more familiar with it and then see if you have any questions. So just a quick reminder about Factom technology. It anchors into public blockchains, and you can use it as a sheet of paper to write anything you want into Factom, meaning you can define your own structures, your own chains, and those could represent different things, including IoT devices. And the other aspect of that is that it's highly scalable and cost-effective. You can actually, with some of the currency fluctuations like in Bitcoin or Ethereum, the volatility is too high for a company to say have a fixed budget that they want to spend per month. And in Factom, we have a tenth of a penny cost. So if you know how many records you're going to write, that's how many dollars you're going to spend, essentially. It doesn't matter what the price does. So with Department of Homeland Security, when we applied for this science and technology program, we basically wrote up a proposal that in which we asked to do the project to secure IoT devices. And we didn't know what devices at that point because DHS was a bit of a mystery. You know, they don't disclose a lot of information. But as time progressed, we got introduced to some vendors, and they told us the list of manufacturers from whom they use, for example, cameras or sensors. What it does is it creates a chain of custody, tamper-proof evidence, which is very important for, you know, from government to judicial systems. And it secures the infrastructure, the U.S. infrastructure, by decreasing some of the attack vectors. We don't claim that this is a panacea to solve all problems that exist on national infrastructures, but it's certainly going to reduce them quite a bit. And we have audit trails. Towards the end of the project, we actually realized that in order to secure this further, you have to run the Factomization as close to the sensor as possible. And of course, there are two types of sensors, ones that do have some kind of an operating system, usually some kind of a Linux-based one, and then other sensors that do not have any operating systems. They're very simple, so you can't run anything on those devices. Data provenance on blockchain, specifically on Factom, allows us to create complete traceability. We can create entity controls. This alludes to identity on the blockchain. Each digital record is unaltered and tamper sealed, so that if someone did try to modify it in any way, that would be instantly detectable, and it would stick out like a sore thumb. So the other aspect of this project is still, you shouldn't put on a blockchain just everything. You know, if there's private data, it should stay private, and that should be secured in some, not offline, but separate system that keeps the private information that's protected. But then you create essentially hashes that link to those records, and you can, and that's a public list, the hashes of the data that's been secured. And you can always, if you're on an application that reads the private data from this private repository, and you can compare it to the public ledger, and it'll verify that that data is intact. Okay, so in phase one, we were given a list of manufacturers, and these were cameras that take pictures based on motion. There were like Buckeye cameras and a bunch of other manufacturers who you might know as having cameras for capturing wildlife, animals or hunters or whatever. And in DHS's case, they run these cameras in a network. So there's a private radio network, and each camera could be, from 1 to 2 miles apart. And they communicate and they sort of hop through one another, and then somewhere within a specific grid location, there will be a control center which will collect all those radio signals, typically on a radio modem, and it's attached on USB to a computing system that then processes the information. That information, believe it or not, most of these cameras that sent the information out emailed it. So it was sent as an email. And another vendor had a camera that would just send text messages with pictures. So it's very unsophisticated, not very secure, very easy to eavesdrop on it and so on. So in phase one, we got a lot of these cameras, we set them up, and then based on what we could work with, we had software that would receive those emails, and then they would process those emails, and then we would factomize it, and then it goes into a separate DHS system to view all these records. And that worked pretty well, and it's a way to add blockchain functionality to existing products that are not going to change their software or hardware. So you have to sort of work around it, and you have to enable this blockchain tech on top of these devices, which are not so smart. And that still affords us a level of increased security and traceability, because it's hard to tell so data manipulation or data problems or attack vectors don't always happen on the same layer. They can happen all throughout the life, and maybe even someone could attack that internal database that stores the images and delete a few or something like that. So even though it was emailed over, processed, factomized, the final destination still was protected. Of course, if there was anything happening prior to emailing out, that would be almost impossible to detect. So this was in phase one. For phase 2 and 3, we essentially were given more camera manufacturers to work with. We worked with Panasonic camera and Axis cameras. And then also they threw in a restricted hardware. You can't buy this unless you have a license or permission from DHS, ground sensors. So these are very rugged systems that you dig into the ground, and they have antennas, and it runs its own private encrypted radio network and a central collection point. And they detect motion, direction of motion, footsteps, or metal. So if a car drives by, it has magnetometers that will detect that it's something metal. So we took additional equipment, and we applied very similar approaches in phase 1. It was processing the information at the point of collection and emailing it out. The one thing that's interesting about all these devices that we've been working with, the vendors of these devices, they do have a pretty mature, by time comparison, systems that allow you to aggregate the data from their sensors. So in Vortex, if you want, you can just use, let's say, their cloud platform to collect all those events, and then you can log in and look at them. So that's another point where a vendor could employ blockchain technology, but you have to get them to modify their software that would also send the transaction to the blockchain. Panasonic cameras were very, they had an insane number of parameters and options to work with. So they're highly sophisticated, but very difficult to work with. It was not an easy camera. Axis cameras, on the other hand, were really interesting to work with. This is the camera that runs its own operating system, Linux. So you can actually, and they have a program where you can write your own apps and publish them, and then other users of Axis cameras can choose to download that as sort of like an Apple iStore concept. Okay. So yeah, on the Axis cameras, the application was written mostly in C, so pretty low level. It's deployed on the camera itself, and whenever there's an event that's triggered, such as detection of movement or picture or video that's captured, at that point you could take that stream of data, factomize it, and then it goes on further to a repository system. But what you've done there is you've employed blockchain technology as soon as the event is generated before it left the device. So you always have that extra security then. And then, on the DHS, there was a GUI framework that they shared with us. It's semi-open source. And this is the GUI framework that they use on a lot of internal systems. So they gave it to us, and we were able to set it up, and all the events, all the data feeds coming into it were in that DHS GUI. And I think it's just easier for them to work with it because they're used to that interface, so they can quickly, you don't have to spend a lot of time training people on how to use that. And you can compare all the records to the blockchain, so when the system reads those records, we also have an automatic rehashing and verification to the public hash, which would allow you to detect an intrusion immediately. In Vortex, for the next phase, we decided to take similar functionality as in running software on Axis cameras and try to embed it into the Vortex controller. The only thing it was capable of doing is receiving the radio signals from the sensors and then displaying them out, and they literally just wrote them out on a serial interface that was on a controller unit. So in the case of Vortex, what we were able to do is write custom software in Golang that read the signals and messaging right off of the interface as soon as it got generated. And then that software would process it, factomize it, and then it would be forwarded on to the ultimate repository system. So it's sort of a hybrid between the phase one dumb devices and fully capable Axis cameras. It does require a separate system that would attach to the controller and then run the software. And then this brings us to phase 4, which is the current phase. It is slated for about 6 months, and very likely it'll get extended because there's a lot of scheduling conflicts on the government side for people to come and see it or to fit into the 6-month time frame. So it'll probably get extended by a month or two. We came out to an El Paso location that the CBP, so Customs and Border Patrol, which is a sub-agency of DHS, they have their own little section on an Air Force base that's out there in El Paso. It's very close to the border, and the conditions resemble the exact, soil and temperature and wind or whatever that you would find right there on a border. And our goal was to deploy the Vortex and the Axis solutions only. And we did that just so that we could test them in a real-world environment and see how they work. Because everything we've been doing prior to that was essentially in a lab. And you may not be exposed to all kinds of interesting things that can happen in a real world, and then your stuff doesn't work. So it's very, very important to field test it. And it allows us to modify it, refactor if there's any deficiencies. So after the visit, we went back, created a sort of an installation list and a plan, assembled all the hardware in the office in a separate environment with its own internet connection and everything. And it was brought up, and we verified that it works. Then it was all packaged up, and we took it with us on a subsequent trip to this location. And then we were given a couple of places where we installed the equipment. So there are 2 Axis cameras you can see, one with a motion sensor, separate motion sensor, and one with night vision and very, very long range. We also installed above those cameras the main antenna for the Vortex controller, which collected the data signals. One of the things that I was worried about a lot is that since this was a military base, I thought that they might have some kind of electronics countermeasures or something from people to be able to interfere or get the signals that are within that military base. So that could have been potentially a problem if that would interfere with this network for the Vortex controllers. But that wasn't the case. It worked right away, and there were no issues with the radio signals. These are highly ruggedized and very durable devices. I mean, you could drive a tank over them, or bend the antenna, whatever. It'll still work. So in these pictures, you kind of see the spot on the ground where we dug it up a little bit and installed a sensor in there, and it got covered up. And then you have the antenna that's sort of sticking out on top of this barrier. We just ran the cable along the side and dropped it in there, so it's pretty inconspicuous. And it started working right away. It detected anybody walking by or vehicles driving by. So that was a very quick test. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was this, the general concept of what we're trying to do here. If you know any good system admins, you will know that they still use dot matrix printers that spits out the log of what's going on in the system. And the reason for that is you create a very fast, it's really fast to print on dot matrix, and you can hear it to catch your attention if you're in the room somewhere. And also, once it's printed, you can't delete it. So quite often, if somebody gets hacked, the hackers will try to cover their tracks. They would delete logs and other things. So it makes it impossible then if they wipe everything out to find out who and where they came from. So in a way, you could use the Factom blockchain as this dot matrix to create a permanent list of events. So you could even configure systems to store that data or just the hashes, and then you have a permanent record that cannot be undone by any hackers. And one of the outcomes out of field testing, besides figuring out how well the software works and modifying it, is there's this stage called commercialization. So what we're looking at very hard now is how what's our plan to commercialize this solution and push it out there to different manufacturers. Ideally, you'd have IoT manufacturers that license the software, and then you help them embed it into their systems, and it becomes an option. If you buy device XYZ, there's a tab somewhere with an option of turn on Factomization or not, and then that would require an account on our Connect platform, which is on 3-scale and is enterprise grade, and that would be our commercialization attempt at this, to get those manufacturers. If anybody has any questions, or Matt couldn't be with us. He's another guy who works on most of the DHS stuff. He was sick, so it's just me. So if anybody has questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yeah.
Can you use the mic so we're recording? Thanks.
So given this pilot, does this data report to other agencies, or is there other ways to kind of expand this work into other agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had, as a result of DHS contact and working with them, we have spoken to several other government and also pseudo-government agencies that were interested in looking at this technology. Yeah.
If phase 4 is deemed to be successful, what next steps are coming your way? Has that discussion begun?
If it's successful, what's the next step?
That's basically my question. If it's deemed to be
okay.
a successful
Okay.
implementation, where do they want to head with this?
So what we would like to see, and we can't say anything definitively about this, but we would like to get this technology installed out there for CBP and attached to all these devices. But in addition to that, they are also working with us on what is our commercialization strategy. So they want to help us get out to these manufacturers and try to convince them to embed our software. And we have something to show them. Like I can, talk to Vortex, which is a fairly small company, and explain what we've done, and hopefully they will choose to make that as an option within their systems. And on Axes, ideally we will publish that app that anybody with an Axes camera can download, run it on their camera, and then talk to the Connect product over the 3-scale APIs. So, and that would drive business on the Harmony Connect side as well. All right. David's on a roll.
So this is a very specific use case. Has the DHS, hopefully the DHS is aware of impending problems like deep fakes, where devices are going to need blockchain embedded at the hardware, or at least within the device itself.
Mm-hmm.
Have discussions along those lines about this massive impending problem that's coming our way, and how this use case is in essence a proof of concept, where there also almost needs to be a regulatory aspect that mandates blockchain compatibility on the device level. Has any sort of discussion along those lines taken place?
Yes. The problem is actually worse than that you're alluding to. A lot of the infrastructure that's out there, especially critical infrastructure, anything from, let's say, security all the way to power plants, water pumps, they have controllers that cannot handle anything other than collect these signals, and they're very prone to getting hacked. So you almost have a whole generation of investment and infrastructure that companies spent money on, install this stuff out there, and it's lacking. So two things can happen. One is you can augment that system by attaching collection points that read it and try to factomize it immediately. And then, of course, later on, a lot of these controllers, they sell the next version, and the next version would have the blockchain capability. We're also talking to another company that creates a hardware device, and it can talk to multiple blockchains. So we're trying to get Factom to be one of those options, and that device connects to a controller or an IoT device via USB serial. Mostly, a lot of it is over serial connections, some Ethernet. The other question, or the other side of this answer, is that we've been told that this particular project is that people are paying attention to it within the government, within even the what do you call it, the lawmaking, regulatory. They are all watching very closely to see what happens and how it works. So there's a lot of interest. There is a mandate in Congress to secure the infrastructure, and they're looking at pretty much anything that could be used for that. And blockchain is very, very much on their radar, and it's a very high visibility project. That's what we've been told.